The fourth exchange of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners has taken place under the fragile ceasefire agreement reached between Israel and Hamas. The names of the 3 Israeli male hostages were announced on Friday and shortly after 8:30 local time on Saturday. Ofer Calderon, a dual French-Israeli citizen, was the first to be released in a well-organised handover to the International Red Cross in Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip. A few minutes later, he was followed by Yarden Bibas, the father of 2 infant children, believed to have died along with their mother during their captivity in Gaza. Now, after receiving their papers, the pair were then driven away by the Red Cross and were officially handed over to the Israel Defense Forces. They were then taken to hospital where they received medical checks and were reunited with family members. The third named hostage, Keith Segal, was handed over in a separate ceremony in Gaza City. The 65-year-old was kidnapped with his wife Aviva Segal in the October the 7th Hamas attacks. Aviva was released after 51 days in captivity and a temporary truce deal in November 2023. And in exchange, a Palestinian advocacy group says Israel is releasing 183 prisoners, more than double the figure previously reported. This was the scene as a bus containing 25 prisoners was greeted in Ramallah. The other group of prisoners headed back to Gaza, and this was the scene in the past half hour as 3 more busloads of Palestinian prisoners arrived back in Khan Yunis. Well, let's go live to Jerusalem and speak to our correspondent Joe Inwood. Joe, bring us up to date.
So the pictures we've seen in the last half hour or so, that is the latest 3 buses, I think it was, of people who were in Israeli jails, Palestinians from Israeli jails, being released back into their communities. Now, it's worth pointing out that some of those people have been in detention for a very long time, accused of very serious crimes, but others have been arrested far more recently and were people who are being held on what's known as administrative detention here in Israel. Israel's critics say they are being held without charge. You had emotional scenes, people mobbing the buses, some people trying to climb up the side in order to touch the hands of their family members. And they are now being released as part of this deal. This is, as we've seen this morning, this is the second part of an exchange. The first part was the release of those 3 men, Keith Segal, Yarden Bibas and Ofer Calderon. They were released in what can only be described as a very stage-managed process, with Hamas fighters flanking them and posters behind them of Hamas leaders who've been killed. So this process has been much more organised, much less chaotic than the one we saw on Thursday, and therefore has gone through far more smoothly, I think, and I think probably will be to the satisfaction of both sides more than the events we saw a few days ago.
And tell us what the latest is with Yarden Bibas, Ofer Calderon and Keith Segal. We understand that they're now headed to a medical facility or should have arrived there already.
Yeah, we've seen pictures coming through over the last hour or so of these 3 men, certainly of 2 of them, Yarden Bibas and Ofer Calderon. I've seen really emotional scenes as they're reunited with their families. We saw Ofer Calderon being hugged by his 4 children. It was clearly a very, very emotional moment for them. And Yarden Bibas with 2 of his relatives as well. Now, of course, for the Bibas family, this is a bittersweet day because Yarden was taken on October the 7th, along with his wife Shiri and Ariel and Kafir, their 2 young children. These 2 young red-headed boys being taken away, held by their mother, was one of the defining images of that day, and it became it, certainly. And I think the fact that Yarden has been released and those 3 have not is being taken as a sign that they are no longer alive. I mean, we don't have confirmation of that, we should say, but it was said by Hamas back in November 2023, so soon after the attacks, that they had been killed, died in an Israeli airstrike. That's never been confirmed by the Israeli government. But I think the fact that they've not been part of this deal and the Israelis have not pushed for them to be part of this first part of the deal suggests that they are no longer alive, because there's quite strict rules about the order in which people are released, and a mother, a civilian woman and 2 young children really would have been in the early stages of this, and the fact they're not I think is being read here as I say, an indication that they are no longer alive.
And Joe, as you mentioned, the Israeli government has not confirmed that statement from Hamas that Ariel and Kfir Bivas were killed in an Israeli airstrike. I just want to read out a statement from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, saying, "Welcome home, Yadin Bibas, Ofer Calderon and Keith Segal, along with all the citizens of Israel and many around the world. My wife and I embrace you upon your return. Our thoughts are now with Shiri, Ariel, Kfir Bivas, and all our abductees. We'll continue to work to bring them home." So, Joe, once again, pointing to the fact that there is still more work to be done to bring back all those Israeli hostages.
Yeah, this is a three-part process, and we're only in stage one of the ceasefire agreement. That first stage saw 33 hostages named as coming back, but there's now a process of negotiation that has to take place between Israel and Hamas, coordinated by the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Americans, to work out how a temporary ceasefire is transformed into something more long-term and something which will see many, many more Palestinians released and the remaining Israeli hostages released. So there's a process. It's set out. The deal between them has never been formally released, but we have seen leaks of it. And there's, according to those leaks, a clear order in which people are released, with women first, then male civilians, and also female soldiers in that, and then eventually we move on to the male soldiers, and then the bodies of hostages who have died will be right at the end. So we're going to go through this process assuming it holds, and I think that is really worth bearing in mind, that although things are progressing as smoothly as either side could hope at the moment, there's no guarantee that this carries on. You have in Israel, you've got really, really strong pressure from the hostage families, and I know we've been speaking to them live throughout the day here on BBC News, and you hear from them that they want to get the families home, whatever the deal that needs to be done. But there are other pressures in this country, and there are other parts, certainly within politics, on the far right of politics here, and we should bear in mind that the coalition government of Benjamin Netanyahu has been dependent upon the far right for its survival. People who do not want to see a continuation of this deal, they want to see a resumption of the fighting. They think that destroying Hamas is a goal that should be achieved, really whatever the cost. And I think that the feeling from hostage families is that the cost that the far right are willing to pay is the remaining hostages. Now, there's a real tension here, and whether this deal continues is something which is going to come down to how the kind of political forces in this country can balance off against each other. And also, it is worth pointing out the role of the Americans, and notably Steve Witkoff, who's the new special envoy here to the Middle East, and of course new President Donald Trump. Because one of the things we've been hearing from the hostage families is they credit him, and they've mentioned him repeatedly, with being the person who has got this deal done. I think there are those in America on the Democratic side of politics who would say, actually, the deal that we've seen here was the one that was suggested by President Joe Biden, former President Joe Biden, back in, I believe, May of last year. And I think it's also been said there was a lot of careful work between former President Biden's aides and now President Trump's aides to get this deal over the line. But here it's President Trump that's getting the credit for this. And I think the hostage families are going to be hoping that his self-proclaimed status as a peacemaker and, of course, as a deal maker is something which is going to see this deal continue and therefore the continued release of hostages. But that really is something we're going to have to wait to find out.